Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear young researchers, thank you very much for your attention to my work, and thank you for inviting me to this series of lecture that I'm very pleased and proud and happy to deliver to the students and researchers of the University of Arizona. I would like to give special thanks to Professor Katerina Kolosova, who took the initiative of this invitation, as far as I know, and to all of those people that made our encounter this evening and our dialogue possible. And also give sincere thanks to my friend, Professor Miglena Nikolchina, who knows my work intimately, and who has just devoted 2 seminars within the framework of this course in order to clarify and discuss some key conceptions and concepts and notions of my research, presenting my trajectory as a theorist, psychoanalyst, novelist, and woman. Today and next week, I'll talk about my rediscovery of the great Russian novelist Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoyevsky, born in 1821, that died in 1881, before tackling 2 other themes next year, themes that I continue to question. The first, I think it will be in spring semester, the need to believe and the desire to know. And later, another theme that is very dear to my thinking and to my heart, of course, that I called Foreign Ethics of the Feminine. So you have already noticed that my English is far from being perfect. So I'll therefore ask you to allow me to read the text of my lecture about what is nihilism in Dostoevsky, which will be projected on the screen thanks to the help of Professor Nikolchin again, whom I thank again for this contribution. Over the years, punctuated by my psychoanalytical practice, I have acquired what I'll call a transgenre style of writing. Neither essay nor novel, both at the same time, a kind of dramatic oratorio, free association, a literary work, sometimes a social phenomena, can reveal to me, I call this an inner experience in which I invest myself. I understand this inner experience, expérience intérieure, in the sense of Georges Bataille, the French writer, who defined it as, I'm quoting, an approval of life into death. In my Dostoyevsky face face à la mort, ou Le sexe hanté du langage, which is my late book on Dostoyevsky, on the way of translation by Columbia University Press. The French title is Dostoyevsky face à la mort, and in English it will be something like Dostoyevsky facing death, or the haunted sex of language. In this last book on Dostoyevsky, I propose, I hope that you'll find it like I consider it, a surprising, I dare to say, total and new Dostoyevsky, galvanized by language. I accompany to the scaffold the writer who was sentenced to death for his revolutionary French ideas. I follow him in the Siberian prison, where he begins his metamorphosis that will lead him to the great novels, The Demons, Brother Karamazov, The Idiot, and so on. A new narrator, clandestine and demonic, is emerging in the jail, in precisely the Notes from the House of Death. He published it in 1862. And also in another book a little bit later, that is called Notes from the Underground, 1864. The disciple of conflicts, as Dostoyevsky defined himself, anticipated the prison-like nature of the totalitarian universe that would be revealed later in the Holocaust and in the Gulag, and that threatens us today through the power of technology. In that oratorio, which is this last book I just mentioned to you, I remember that I found in my native Bulgaria a Russian virus. This expression belongs to the poet Joseph Brodsky, who escaped from this virus in the air, he says, by putting it into the microscope of his poetry. I took for my part the microscope of transference, according to Freud. I recall also in my oratorio, which is my last book, my astonishment as a schoolgirl at the funeral bust of Stalin, the father of people, and at the Soviet dissidents who have something of Dostoyevsky, as it seems to me. Let me share with you this personal involvement in Dostoyevsky's text. When I arrived in France in Christmas Eve, 1965, I discovered that Paris knew the Russian formalist who had inspired French structuralism from Claude Lévi-Strauss to Roland Barthes. Innovative thoughts were inspired by them. Émile Benveniste insisted on the enunciation in the statement, and the enunciation in the grammar and in phonology. So in the psychological aspect or psychoanalytic aspect of speech. Lacan introduced the signifier in the unconscious. The second edition of Mikhail Bakhtin's book, called Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, had just been published in Russian, and we're eager in Bulgaria to read it. Bakhtin pierces in this book the structures of language by searching for its deep logic in dialogue, not a structure, but the dialogue before and within the structure. I only speak in twos. I don't speak by myself. I speak for the other and with the other, he says in substance, positing from the start a constitutive alterity in the proximity, the alterity and proximity together. Bakhtin's Dostoevsky revealed to me a different vision and practice of language as intrinsically dialogical, and of writing as necessarily intertextual, as I'll said it in some theoretical works that I wrote afterwards. I had to bolster this with Husserl's phenomenology and Freud's and Melanie Klein's clinical thought in order to make it more precise and develop its deep logic. The signifier, the semiotic core, and the symbolic. I suppose Professor Nikolchina had already introduced it in this problematic of mine that is influenced, if not founded, by my reading of Dostoevsky through Bakhtin, and that I developed in my book, Revolution of Poetic Language from 1974. Afterwards, the interpretation of the works of Céline, Proust, Artaud, Colette, Solers, Duras, etc., were to follow. And they provided the tenuous, prudent, and indecent pleasure according to the words again, the Georges Bataille, pleasures in search of a strangeness which expanded the self, the otherness that is in ourselves, foreign to ourselves, I said in one other book that maybe some of you know. Should I turn then, when I touch to this otherness in ourselves, should I turn to the metaphysics, to spirituality, to different religion experience, which had programmed the tools of the human sciences? Or should I look for something which, not being got, disappeared in the night of pure writers, in the ardor of rebellious moralists? Neither one, spirituality, neither other, the fetishism of writing. Psychoanalysis was to open new stimulating horizon to me. And this is from this horizon of psychoanalysis that I try to reread Dostoyevsky again, and that we'll find in my last two books on Dostoyevsky. Psychoanalysis, and when I use this word, of course, you speak of Lacan, and you know one of the most famous psychoanalysts today. Lacan captured psychosexuality in brilliant shortcuts, which sliced into the flesh of words, but which also distanced me from him, as, for example, in the case when he gravitated around what he saw purely topological origin of language, without speaking precisely and directly about drives, organism, sexuality as organic experience, but as a purely topological origin of language. The laborious patience of Freud suited me better than those shortcuts of Lacan, were very exciting, stimulating too. The laborious patience of Freud suited me better, even in his reading of Dostoyevsky, which he waged in the grid of Oedipal desire, noting, however, the pre-psychic oddities, the mechanism of abnormal organic discharge in this strange Russian genius. Incredulous readers don't fail to apostrophize me. Love Dostoyevsky, the author of my life. They ask me this because not last, but before my last book about Dostoyevsky, I wrote a book in the collection called Authors of My Life. It is sort of selection of extras of choice text of Dostoevsky with a preface, and the preface in question is now translated by Columbia University Press but with the title The Flood of Dostoevsky and the Flood of Language. So people finding my book on Dostoevsky in the collection Author of My Life ask me if he is an author of your life, maybe you love Dostoevsky. Is it possible to love Dostoevsky? And my answer is that both expressions, love and author of myself, are too narrow to convey the engulfment and the regeneration triggered to me, and I hope triggered in you when you read Dostoevsky, by the vocal range of this swirling sense that both bothers and uplifts us in reading this Russian writer. A free-flowing writing is confronting its translators from the beginning of the translation of Dostoyevsky in French or in English or in other languages. And the translators were confronted with the pitfalls of this free-flowing, which they are not unaware and which they exhaust themselves to rationalize. Not as confusing was the hyperbolic title of the series, Authors of My Life. Is my life entirely directed and shaped by him? Because also in the series I'm referring, there are other books comprising the overwhelming names of the contributors of this collection that I discovered afterwards. For instance, there is a book about Descartes by Paul Valéry, Schopenhauer by Thomas Mann, Max by Trotsky, and Dostoyevsky by Julia Kristeva. Many times I wanted to protect myself from this poignant tradition, to give up, until I read Andrei Markovich's translation of Dostoevsky in French, which restored to the French language his genius of letting the speech unfold without fear of the sacred. The dazzling gallery of characters, Dostoevskian characters, redoubled and multiplied, the archipelago of female solitudes that assume transgression, even pedophilia, submerge the finitude of our confined passions. And this context of being struck and uplifted by this strange, very hyperbolic and swirling vocal range of writing, the theme of nihilism struck me because it's a theme that obsesses the writer. Nihilism, I'll give you a definition of how Dostoevsky understands nihilism, which is, of course, a very short and condensed definition and not exhausting, but interesting and opening our interest into this term. He says the following: nihilism appeared among us because we are all nihilists. Where did the nihilists come from? They did not come from anywhere. They have always been within us, in us, near us. He wrote this in the notebooks from 1881 towards the end of his life. Let us stop and think about this sentence. What does it mean when he says that nihilism is in us? What means us? We? Who is we? We, the Russians, because he's Russian and he's very proud of being Russian. I'll speak a little bit about this lecture in the following. We, the Russians, torn between Europe and Asia, that attracts and repel each other. Each Europe and Asia fascinated and baffled by the habits and the customs of the other. Is it we, the Orthodox as an Orthodox religion, not Catholic, not Protestant, but Orthodox, devoted to the pathos of the elements? This is the definition that Solzhenitsyn gives to orthodoxy. Pathos stichi, the pathos of elements, cruel underground of passions, and plaintive adoration of icons. A veritable village nihilist, says Dostoevsky in a novel called Vlas. Necessary sublime as an experience, because very primitive, original, regressive, but at the same time may be preferable to the sloggy doctrinaire subscribed to the scholastic pleasure of the understanding, that we are more of us Westerners. If we think about the characters in Dostoyevsky, Raskolnikov, Stavrogin, Kirillov, Verkhovensky, Ivan Karamazov, the great heroes of Dostoyevsky are nihilists, atheists, deniers of God, but also don't protest against him too much in a sort of religious involvement in their conviction. The conviction becomes a sort of religion. You worship the Holy Spirit without knowing it, diagnoses Tikhon while listening to Stavrogin's confession in the novel The Demon. Kirillov commits suicide to be free and alone, but shouting with a religious passion, freedom, equality, fraternity, or death. Orthodox Russia might not have been the cradle of nihilism if we are all nihilists did not concern us all. So I mean here that nihilism is not only this development, spreading out, bursting of passion without thinking, just feeling emotion, love and hate, eros and thanatos, as Freud said, but also because without being orthodox, the speaking humanity, according to Freud, is split between the passion and the knowledge, the drive and the meaning. Our humanity today globalized and more than ever in war, which participate in this sense in nothingness and nihilism. Since when? Since unbridled liberalism, colonialism, the rise of technology, since the history of metaphysics, which contains nihilism in its essence, as Heidegger sustains, meaning that the development of techniques that puts nihilism open because the technique cannot think the passion that is beneath the meaning. According to Freud, the reason of the existing of nihilism in us is not technology only, but the fact that we are speaking being, that the speech is developed over, up, on the bottom of passion, drives, love and hate. So from the beginning, as well as we speak, we're split between meaning and negation of passion that is bursting beneath and threatening meaning. Today, Dostoevsky's writing challenges in depth the social and political history of Europe, but also of speaking beings in the world. Dostoevsky's novels are novels of thought. His theme, his topic is thinking with, against, and in companion with drives and jouissance or destruction. The polyphony of the text is the only way, says the writer in substance, to penetrate with reverence the underground of nihilism and to transmit this enigmatic Dostoevskian jouissance, the word naslаждение means in Russian jouissance, the jouissance of writing that leaves the nihilism behind us. We have to try to write, to sublimate nihilism, this bursting of meaning, this destruction that is in us, and not to deny the passion, but to give it different creative expressions. I'll not discuss today the two philosophical approaches that have articulated the radically new reality of nihilism in the 20th century. The approach of Ernst Junger in three books, The Worker, On Pain, and Concerning the Line, and who links nihilism to the massification put in place during the First World War and in the world order subjugated to technology. And the other approach, which is the approach of Heidegger in the Introduction to Metaphysics and Question 1, who invites us to think an inclusion of being into nothingness and to consider man as the seat holder for nothingness, who does not only stands in the critical zone of the line, but is himself, says Heidegger, the zone of thus the line. It's not transgressing the line, we are the line, whose only overcoming would be to abandon the language of metaphysics in figures, not in understanding, but figurating the burst of drives until наслаждение, jouissance, and destruction, in provocation of thought. I refer to my Dostoyevsky Facing the Dead in order to discuss these two authors, Ernst Junger and Heidegger. Today, I'll not do this. I'll come back to my psychoanalytic perspective in which I'll stick today. I try to understand the universal nihilism that Dostoevsky diagnoses brilliantly before Freud and the Freudian. This Dostoevskian comprehension of our splitting and the proximity between nihilism and understanding resonates with a cluster of psychoanalytical concepts: splitting, rejection, denial, foreclosure, but also the work of negative hallucination, double reversal, etc., which I'll not discuss here in order not to address only those who are involved in psychoanalysis, but to make my approach to Dostoevsky more available to those that will read with me Dostoevskian heroes. When Freud himself approaches Dostoevsky, whom he does not really like, as he writes in a letter to Rank, "My patience with pathological natures is running out," says he. Freud is in the process of modifying his conception of psychic apparatus. Repression, Oedipus, and neurosis are not enough. Thanatos emerges, splitting, Eros, were in the Beyond of Pleasure Principles from 1920. Nevertheless, the Freudian confrontation with Dostoevsky, whom the founder of psychoanalysis divided in four. He speaks about Dostoevsky as a writer, as a neurotic, as a moralist, and as a sinner. All these four branches, aspects of Dostoevsky is placed, nevertheless, in the Oedipus complex. And he criticizes Dostoevsky, and in the same time, he places him not far from Shakespeare. But all this is in the grids of Oedipal complex. My reading, on the contrary, proposes to probe the Dostoevskian polyphony with regard of the Freudian second topicality, the heterogeneity between drive and sense, the limit states, the breakdown according to Winnicott, and transformation according Bion. My idea will be that modern psychoanalysis, this of Winnicott and Bion, will be closer to Dostoevskian comprehension of human being. From the very beginning of psychic life, because according to the second Freud, the psychic life is such that the drives of immediate satisfaction and pleasure are deferred, retained, engrammed in mnemonic traces, which in their turn are granted to the internal and external perceptions to compose, recompose, redo and undo. It is the 0 degree of thought, the representation of the drives. Matter, which is neurons, brains, nervous system, renounces immediate pleasure and builds beyond it a substitute. It is our capacity to engram, to represent, to memorize, to think, to speak, to play, to write. We construct, we speaking being, a neo-reality that arrives at the price of a break, a leap, a generating cut. Freud calls it a psychic revolution of matter. And you can find this in a very interesting small piece of Freud from 1911 called A Formulation of the Two Principles of Mental Functioning. This psychic preformation initiates the original repression that makes possible the human capacity to speak and to think. The assumption of the libidinal components dispenses a specific new pleasure, which accompanies the creation of the symbol of negation and all symbols which will follow. Being appears under the form of non-being as thoughts, and a new pleasure, the pleasure of thoughts, but not only the organic pleasure of organic zones. The repressed is taken up in a sort of independence from repression, a suspension inscription in the flesh of drives and as well as in the flesh of words. This is sublimation. Lacan avoids this psychosexual economy by pivoting around what he calls the purely topological origin of language, and which is not satisfaction, it doesn't give satisfaction for me. He says this, is the speaking being speaking because of something that has happened to sexuality, or has something happened to sexuality because it is the speaking being? I prefer to return to Melanie Klein and her conception of the depressive position as a necessary condition for access to ideas and language. Or Marcel Proust, for whom the ideas are the successors of sorrows. He already knew something from Freud, we can suppose, when he says that ideas are successors of sorrows, as Melanie Klein will say. My work on objection, a crossroad of phobia, obsession, and perversion, elucidates this economy by which revolt is completely within the being of language. The separation with the object is a process of rejecting the object as awful, terrorizing, phobic, negative, and at the same time something that I have the obligation to utilize in order to name it and to make new pleasure from the process of naming itself. We call this place where neurons crumble and where Dostoyevsky and demons pour, splitting, a cut of refraction of the subject. Freud's disciples have pressed their clinic into this region. Death of self, death of the other, and resurrection of both. Surrection, the word is from James Joyce, away, surrection, Finnegan's Wake. Dostoevsky anticipated, attributing the rage of this reversal to the narrator who polemicized with Chernyshevsky clandestine Lopukov, confronting and integrating at the bottom of the underground the wicked man, the sick man, the repulsive man, the paradoxical man, and turning up more alive. Is from the Notes from the Underground, which is maybe the most important and to begin with it as an introduction to Dostoyevsky's other novel, we have to read the Notes from the Underground, where the man is disgusted from himself, from the others, and because of the expression of this destruction, this negativity, that he's able to follow the capacity to resurrect. I hear in this text also Dostoevsky, the epileptic, the man condemned to death, the convict on the verge of madness and unbeing, who live at the ultimate limit and spend his life crossing it, as he says in a letter to his friend, the poet Maikov. His breathless sentence, his jerky narrative that proceeds by leaps and paradox, renounces immediate pleasure and builds beyond it a substitutive neo-reality that comes at the price of break, a generating cut. Long before Freud and psychoanalysts, Dostoevsky realized that the epileptic explosion and its pains, fear and anxiety put him in contact with an essential dimension of the human condition, which is the coming into being and the eclipse of the sense, the senses and the sense, the destruction of himself, as in the coma of the epilepsy, and the capacity to meet again, be capable of senses and sense. These streams, these streaming words of Dostoevsky character reveal the minor splitting, to use the Melanie Klein terms, generating cascading mini narratives which destabilize the narrative thread and make Dostoevsky's universe a unfinished multiverse, created as a form of sarcasm, he specifies. The narrator's laughter crackles inside the wound, within the ruthless suffering from the split that separates and reunites perception and perceive, same and other, flesh and word, life and death. My immersion in Dostoevsky's writing can be read as a continuation of my reflection on the new maladies of the soul, which warned of the destruction or even disappearance of the psychic space bequeathed to us by the Greek, Jewish, and Christian tradition with the Muslim graft, and which psychoanalysis is probing and refining today against the current of anthropological acceleration. One could say that the author of Demons was the Russian Sade, in the sense of Marquis de Sade, sadism. Certainly, but playing and upplaying passions, homoeroticism, feminicide, and even pedophilia. And I'll speak the next lecture about this. And by inspiring us to begin, continue, and innovate our own approval of light into death. A kind of self-analysis through reading, according to Rowan Williams, a leading Dostoevsky scholar, former Archbishop of Canterbury and professor, constitutive hiatus in the narrative. And I'm quoting from Rowan Williams that I'll recommend you to read this, his introduction to my last book in Columbia Press about Dostoevsky, a short book. But he's saying this: but the act of telling itself posits the area of obscurity, a hiatus between pure stimulus and its transnarration, in the sense that the act of telling opens up diverse possibilities, the unspoken potential for something to be said otherwise. Division and duality are inscribed in speech. Whenever something is said, we acknowledge its connection with what is said elsewhere and otherwise, because if we didn't, if we that would not be communication at all. And further on, another abstract from the interpretation of Rowan Williams of my reading of Dostoyevsky. Why continue to read Dostoyevsky? If Kristeva is right, the answer is so that we may learn what not many compatriots, so what we may learn, what not many contemporaries can teach us, and what a systematic secularism cannot teach us. Something about how desire becomes human, about how speech and storytelling work to humanize our desire and our fears of murderous absorption and our own murderous resort to abjection in enacting our desire and our terror, about need for a symbolic that makes space for the recognition of love. Dostoevsky's Christic fiction holds open that space, and we neglect it in our mortal peril as a culture, even as a species. If you follow this reflection, which summarizes my interest about the split and in the same time, proximity to the destruction, the horror, and the morbid objection, we may be able to listen in another way, more personal, more macroscopic, and maybe deeper about what happens today. For instance, the war in Ukraine, that confirms in my mind what I wrote about Dostoevsky. Embarrassed by Russia, this is my quotation, a quotation of my last book. Embarrassed by Russia, troubled by nihilism, Europe has a hard time with its orthodox part. The quote. The second part of my book recalls the particularity of the Orthodox faith, in which Dostoevsky finds shelter while adapting it to his psychosexuality. Two types of Oedipus structure, Christian morality. The Orthodox per filium suggests by the preposition per, who means by, a delightful but pernicious annulment of the Son and the believer by the all-power authority of the Father, Pantocrator, whereas the Catholic filioque by the preposition que, and puts the Father and the Son, and thus the believer, on an equal footing, privileging the autonomy and independence of the person and paving the way of Western individualism and personality. The Holy Spirit comes from the Father per filium, by the Son, and from the Father and the Son, equality and not submission. The subjectivity is spirit by per filium could be interpreted as belonging to an unfinished Oedipus, but who can boast of a resolved Oedipus that keeps the Son in a fusion diet rather than fostering the Oedipal triangulation, which means rebellion and overcoming that any speaking subject is supposed to access. This orthodox structuring disinhibits the expression of an older psychic layer, masochism and primitive anxieties, exalting depressive narcissism, lamentation, and death. Since the inexpressible and incommensurable divine authority admits neither discussion, nor criticism, nor negation, it only remains for anguish to express itself by destruction. The Orthodox faith invites the believer to surrender to sensory osmosis with absolute otherness, to the point of annihilation. Although if the touching bonds of the Orthodox community are so strong and prevail over kenosis, which is the annulment of the divine on the Good Friday, the free singularity remains always in suffering in the religious mapping of the psychology and the religion. And in this structure, the materialistic revolution that succeeded the religious construction of the singularity, the materialistic resolution that succeeds the religious mapping of the psyche that accompanies it today, is done in the Orthodox countries in the pagan way, aspiring only to the deep over into the market economy, whereas the emancipation moving stemming from Christian humanism aimed at the resurrection of the unique to the infinite diversity of the rebellious critics. This does not preclude the aspiration to universal communion supposed to be necessarily Russians from awakening Orthodox nostalgia among the oligarchs themselves. For orthodoxy, structurality lends itself to political instrumentation. For a Christian, there is no church without an emperor, declared Patriarch Antony in the 14th century. Dostoyevsky's self-analysis accumulated this hallucinatory theological theorization, to which his characters give themselves up, their contradictions, their clashes, and their judgments, multiplying the meaning and the resonance of faith up to the absurd and laughter, which is not erasing the faith, but conjugate gravity with unnameable. By privileging the sensuous and the antinomic thinking, orthodoxy, in the manner of Dostoevsky, seems to carry the memory of the gnosis. The gnosis, the gnostic model, is not that of creation of identity and incarnation. It posits the anteriority of the pleroma, which is abundance, a prior antecedence, pre-cosmic and pre-father, an antecedent beginning that sets itself in motion by the play of contrary forces which animate it, and generating a sort of emanation, which is a plurality of the world, but also a plurality of identities. I'll shorten this development here by saying that instead of the plurality that we inherited from metaphysics, Dostoevsky, instead of the duality that we inherited from the metaphysics of ontotheology, Dostoevsky based his fictional thinking on plurality, on the abundance of the multiplicity of voices, which even when he uses faith and orthodoxy, he uses it in the carnivalesque way, and a carnival, in the sarcasm, in laugh, in pluralizing the sense of multiplying meanings and confronting us to the absurd and to the unnameable. So in this pluralistic notion of meaning seems to me closer not to our ontotheology and metaphysics, but more to the Jewish Kabbalah's Tzimtzum, which is infinite stimulation movement of contraction and expansion. The novels and the characters of Dostoyevsky expound and restrict themselves, and we cannot grasp them in the finite figures and definitive messages. They are plural, they are incomprehensible, they are Russians, they are human, they are more than nihilistic, they are complex, as is human being. So we can, in this sense, answer, are the Karamazov brothers Oedipal parasites, or are they Kabbalistic Gnostics? I would prefer to say they are polyphonic, and they leave every question open. Now, let's me in 10 minutes and give you 15 minutes for questions. Let me try to clarify or to make more concrete this problematic, to give an example of my reading of one novel, which is The Gambler from 1866, where the narrator is the gambler himself. The narrator is called Alexei Ivanovich. He's the young tutor of a general's children. He falls in love with the beautiful daughter of this old man, Polina Alexandrovna, who is going to play him. In the novel, Alexis becomes addicted to gambling as he gets caught up in the game and experiences, I'm quoting, the enjoyment like no other, except that of a whip when it stems into our backs and tears our flesh, at the quote. It's very sadistic jouissance. That of the whip when it slams into the backs of and tears our flesh. This stinging image betrays not a teacher, not a tutor, but a convict. It is not Alexis, the tutor of the naive general's children. It is Dostoyevsky, the convict, who feels the whims of chance and who shudders when he hears the voice of the chief dealer declare the last 3 spins, gentlemen. He was a gambler himself. In Notes from the House of Death, Dostoyevsky describes the convict who are thirsty for alcohol and whipped, and who manage to get money to gamble and lose while laughing. And the novelist tells us that in this debauchery, there is the laughter of freedom. End of quote. Quoted only a dream of freedom. Spending his money, the convict acts as a free man. The psychopathological problem of gambling becomes here metaphysical. It's not only spending, freedom is also a metaphysical problem. And in this way, Dostoevsky and his sadism, Dostoevsky as Sadian, becomes a Pascalian. Why? Because suffering and freedom are the same and reverse parts of our psyche. To bet is to make a wager, to win, to be free, to get out of it. To bet is a way of believing. Can we dare not to believe? Not sure. You are free to bet on the void. That is what Alexis will do. After losing everything, but one last coin, he didn't dare not to believe, and he bet on the zero, on the void, on the lack, on nothing. And he won. How not to bet on the lack when one has not that, one has only that to dare. And it is already huge. It makes you live because you can have a project, although we don't know what is this project, but you only open it. Readers dare to bet, dare to believe, says in substance the gambler. It is, in my mind, by depicting this gambler, a picture of the modern humanity that Dostoyevsky gives us to us, that is being born around Dostoyevsky and through his writing. It is already a prisoner humanity, a concentration camp. All convicts imprisoned, held by socioeconomic and administrative constraints, confined, we would say today, by liberticidal procedures, convict, lined by their poor version of gamblers who need to believe even it is in the void. Money, debauchery, and freedom is one of Dostoyevsky's obsessive themes, along with the trio of lovers, 2 men and 1 woman, 2 men and 1 man, 2 women and 1 man, and also the theme of the raped little girl, about which I'll speak next week. Money is everything, diagnoses the novelist, a keen observer of the situation in Russia, a country where rampant capitalism was sweeping away the old Russia at the end of the 19th century. But not only the gambler is Sadian and Pascalian, it is more complex because nothing is simple in Dostoevsky's work. Everything is money and everything is permitted, as a nihilistic says. This vision will lead the writer himself to the fantasy of the Jew, who by possessing money would possess all the powers, vices, and the manipulations. A sort of hate-loving of the Jews is widespread in Dostoevsky's work. On the one hand, his unabashedly populist political anti-Semitism, which is explicit in his text, The Jewish Opinion, his diary from 1877. And on the other hand, a continuous veneration of the biblical message against contradiction, senses and sense, destruction and jouissance, anti-Semitism and worship and veneration of biblical message. The Jew, brotherly neighborhood and threatening rival, but no less supreme authority, as attested to by what Dostoevsky called the wake-up call in the synagogue that will put an end to the jouissance under the lash of the whip at the casino. And let me finish with this anecdote that happened in Wiesbaden and that he calls the wake-up call in the synagogue. It happens in 1871 in Wiesbaden. The novelist, tormented and ashamed to have lost everything, willing to confess for the umpteenth time in an Orthodox church, finds himself unwillingly but pushed by the fate, as he says, in a synagogue. He wanted to say to go to to a Christian Orthodox church, but it was a synagogue. And he writes this to his wife. It was a wake-up call for me. A great work was accomplished in me. A stupid, despicable fantasy that had been tormenting me for 10 years vanished. Now it's all over. I was bound by the game. Now I would think only of my work, not bound to the passion of destruction of myself, of losing and of annihilating myself. Now I will think only of my work. My work will be done better and faster, and God will bless me. End of quote. Would he have heard the last job that he had known by heart still since his childhood? Because he says that he had learned about job since his childhood. His mother had told him about job. This job that young Elihu reconciles with Yahweh, neither guilty nor innocent, repudiating transgression and mortification. Yahweh gave him a sign. Dostoyevsky is never reconciled, but as Job will be, through transgressions and mortification, he finally is unified with his God, which doesn't come to Dostoyevsky. He always said until the end of his life that he is believer and non-believer in the same time. He's a child of the Enlightenment, but at the same time a very enthusiastic Russian Orthodox. But he's never reconciled, every time split. But the moment of the wake-up call, the unnameable recognized him, perhaps neglect him almost. Dostoevsky will not longer go to the casino. The work alone, without destruction, now takes over from the roulette wheel. Writer now will write. He knows that writing is a game of chance, of light and death. Every writer today, in a sense, knows this, and Philippe Solers makes this clear by calling one of his novels Portrait d'un joueur, portrait of a gambler. The novel The Gambler was dictated to the young stenographer Anna Grigorievna Snitkina, 25 years his junior, who would become his wife. Without the gambler stopping to exhaust himself during 5 years from 1866 to 1871, in this wake-up encounter with the Jewish God in the synagogue, he stopped exhausting himself at roulette and dissipated the door of his wife. The great novels will follow: The Demons from 71, The Adolescent, The Brother Karamazov. And we will talk again about Dostoevsky and women, because it is to his woman that he narrates what happens in the synagogue, and he continued to write in another way, not the neurotic, but the post-neurotic carnival writing polyphonic writer. Thank you.